On April 8, 2026, investigators walked onto a 46-foot sailboat with a warrant for causing bodily harm. The vessel was the Soulmate. The owner was Brian Hooker. His wife, Lynette Hooker, had vanished into the Sea of Abako 4 days earlier. A grieving husband facing a tragic loss at sea does not trigger a bodily harm warrant. A standard maritime disappearance does not require the seizure of digital video recorders and navigation tablets. The mainstream version of this case presents a tragic accident in dark water. But the documented legal actions tell a completely different story. If you want every development in this case as it happens, subscribe, because this story is still moving. The initial narrative was straightforward. On the night of April 4, 2026, Brian Hooker and Lynette Hooker were traversing the waters near the Abico Inn in a small dinghy. The weather was deteriorating. The winds were strong. According to the account provided to authorities, Lynette fell into the water. She was holding the engine's kill cord. The engine cut out. The wind separated them. Despite efforts to paddle and search, Brian reported losing sight of her in the darkness. He eventually reached Marsh Harbor Boatyard alone at approximately 4 in the morning. A massive search protocol was initiated. The United States Coast Guard deployed aerial assets. The Royal Bahamas Defense Force executed surface patrols. Drones swept the coastlines. If this were a simple case of a woman swept away by a sudden current, the objective would be recovery. The ocean, despite its vastness, operates on predictable mechanical laws. But as the hours turned into days, the nature of the search fundamentally shifted. When officials deploy cadaver dogs to a coastline, they are no longer looking for survivors. They are acting on a specific investigative belief. Yet the physical environment refused to cooperate with the established narrative. The Sea of Abako is a largely enclosed system. The tides, the wind, and the currents from that specific night were mapped and analyzed. The physics of the ocean demanded that if a person went into the water exactly where it was claimed, a trace would emerge. But the water offered nothing. And that absence of physical evidence, it pointed directly to a legal problem no one had anticipated. A search warrant is not a procedural formality. It is a documented legal judgment. To execute the April 8, 2026 warrant on the Soulmate, investigators could not simply walk aboard on a hunch. They had to articulate a specific legal theory to a judge. They had to document probable cause. They had to explain exactly what crime they believed had occurred and why evidence of that crime would be found on that specific vessel. In standard maritime missing person cases, the legal language reflects the tragedy. Warrants are drafted to seek evidence related to the circumstances of a disappearance. But the Bahamian judge who reviewed this application signed off on a fundamentally different legal framework. The authorized language was material evidence related to a missing person causing bodily harm. That terminology requires an act. It requires intent. It requires a perpetrator and a victim. A judge evaluated the available facts and determined they met the threshold for that specific legal standard. Defense arguments frequently minimize the severity of search warrants, suggesting they are merely routine, wide nets cast by overzealous detectives. Crystal Marie Hauer, the U.S.-based attorney representing Brian, has publicly argued there is absolutely no evidence to support any allegations. But a judicial signature is an independent evaluation of documented facts. It cannot be retroactively narrowed by public relations. When investigators boarded the Soulmate, they did not just document the physical space. They removed the digital brain of the vessel. They seized a digital video recorder. They took digital tablets. They removed cell phone-related equipment. They targeted the devices that log GPS coordinates, record automatic identification system pings, and store deleted messages. The physical search of the ocean had yielded no answers. The investigation was moving into the digital realm, looking for the timeline the water could not provide. The assumption was that the devices would simply confirm the tragic narrative of an accident at sea. But digital forensics does not care about narratives. It only cares about timestamps. The legal threshold for holding a suspect requires evidence, and without a physical body, the defense possesses a formidable advantage. The Royal Bahamas Police Force held Brian Hooker, questioned him regarding causing harm resulting in death, and ultimately released him pending further investigation. The case appeared to stall in the absence of physical recovery. The narrative of the heartbroken sailor lost in a sudden storm seemed poised to become the official historical record. The authorities had nothing tangible to hold him on, until the forensic examiners began extracting the metadata from the seized devices, searching for the digital exhaust of erased files. Because wipe storage leaves patterns, and what investigators know about the timeline of those deletions, do you think the forensic extraction of the seized Apple Watch will confirm the 6:38 p.m. departure from the Abico Inn, or does it explain the deleted device metadata? If the next filing changes what we covered today, you will want to be here for it. To understand the gravity of the digital evidence, you have to look at the physical impossibility of the ocean drift models. The marine environment is not a void. It is a highly predictable kinetic system. The Sea of Abako functions similarly to a massive contained basin. The currents at Tulu Cut are documented. If an object enters the water under the wind and tide conditions present on April 4th, experts know exactly where it will travel. The drift models simulate the trajectory. The results were absolute. If Lynette Hooker went into the water at the described location, her body, or at least a trace of her clothing or personal effects, would inevitably drift to the eastern shores or remain visible within the enclosed sea. But there was no trace. The scientific model of the ocean did not match the spoken account of the incident. When science and narrative collide, investigators look for the variable that can be manipulated. The ocean cannot lie about its currents. Therefore, the timeline of the narrative must be examined. Brian Hooker stated, "They left the Abico Inn around 7:30 in the evening." The darkness of the impending storm was a central element of the tragic account. But surveillance cameras are impartial witnesses. The video data from the Abico Inn recorded their departure. The timestamp was 6:38 p.m. 52 minutes. In a controlled forensic timeline, a 52-minute discrepancy is an eternity. It is the gap between daylight and darkness. It is the difference between a verifiable location and an unknown void. Why did the reported timeline shift by nearly an hour? The bartender noted the arithmetic of the timeline made no sense. Leaving at 6:38 p.m. and arriving at Marsh Harbor Boatyard at 4 a.m. meant hours of unaccounted time in a contained body of water. The inconsistencies bled into the mechanical details. The initial account stated Lynette was holding the engine's safety lanyard, the kill cord, when she went overboard, instantly disabling the dinghy. Yet those who knew their routines, including her daughter Carly Allisworth, noted Brian was always the one driving. He controlled the lanyard. If the established operational pattern of the vessel placed the key in his hand, how did it end up in hers at the exact moment she fell? The timeline discrepancy and the mechanical questions were enough to trigger the bodily harm warrant. But investigators still had to place the two of them together on that dinghy at the exact moment of departure. The 6:38 p.m. surveillance footage confirmed they left the grounds. It seemed to establish the baseline of the tragic journey. They were walking away from the safety of the shore, heading towards the Soulmate. The camera recorded the movement. The timeline was shifting, but the core narrative of the two of them leaving together seemed intact. Until a separate video clip, timestamped closer to 7 p.m., captured Brian Hooker moving toward the dock. The camera recorded his movement clearly, but as investigators scanned the frame for the woman in the green cover-up, she was not in the footage. There is no independent visual confirmation of Lynette Hooker's position at that precise time. The window of uncertainty had just expanded. This absence in the footage forces a reevaluation of the entire foundation of their relationship leading up to April 4th. The public profile presented a dream of off-grid maritime adventure. The feeds were saturated with sunsets, dancing videos, and serene water. But the private communications documented a terrifying alternate reality. In January 2024, Lynette sent messages to her friend Marnie Stevenson. The text was unambiguous. It was real bad. I can't be out there with him. She stated their cruising marriage lasted 6 weeks. She declared she was not going back. Yet a month later, she returned. What drives a woman who is terrified of the isolation of the ocean to return to the very vessel she fled? The investigation has gathered accounts from neighbors and family that paint a volatile picture. Allegations emerged that Brian had choked her. Carly Allisworth relayed claims of a history of violence, including threats to throw her overboard so she would never be found. These remain unverified allegations, not legal convictions. It is a matter of public record that Brian Hooker was acquitted of a child abuse charge in Michigan in 2006. An acquittal means no finding of guilt, but for investigators building a psychological profile to support a causing bodily harm warrant, the documented history of police involvement forms a critical layer of context. This context is why two parallel investigations are running simultaneously. The Royal Bahamas Police Force retains primary jurisdiction, confirming through Commissioner Shanta Knowles that Brian remains a suspect. Concurrently, the United States Coast Guard has opened its own criminal investigation. A Coast Guard criminal probe is not deployed for standard search and rescue coordination. It signifies formal investigative resources committed to determining if a crime occurred under U.S. federal maritime law. The stakes are immense. Without a body, a prosecution is extraordinarily difficult. Terrell Butler, Brian's Bahamas attorney, has clearly articulated the defense position. Without discovering a body, proving foul play leading to death is a massive legal hurdle. Brian Hooker maintains his innocence, stating publicly that his sole focus is finding his wife, denying all allegations of violence or involvement in her disappearance. He is presumed innocent under the law. But the seized electronics sit in an evidence room. The Apple Watch that Lynette was photographed wearing was reportedly found on the Soulmate. If she fell into the water wearing it, how did the device return to the boat? The navigation system on the 46-foot sailboat continuously transmits GPS location signals. That digital footprint is recorded by satellites. It cannot be altered by memory. It cannot be rewritten by a defense attorney. The outcome of this case hinges on the collision between natural laws and digital facts. The ocean currents refuse to hide a body that wasn't there. The surveillance cameras refuse to validate a timeline that didn't align. The metadata on the seized devices will either definitively confirm a tragic accident or it will expose the architectural framework of a crime. When the law requires evidence of bodily harm, the digital exhaust of a life is often the only witness that cannot be silenced. If this case matters to you, the next development is one you will not want to miss. Whether the forensic extraction of the seized Apple Watch confirms the 6:38 p.m. departure from the Abico Inn and whose wrist it was on at the time is a question the initial warrant return has not yet answered.